Welcome to the deep dive. Grab your curiosity because today we're plunging into a stack of sources focused on a truly um, outside the box figure, Viktor Schauberger.
That's right.
His ideas really challenge how we think about nature, particularly, how we manage our most vital resources, forests, water, soil.
Absolutely. The material we have dives deep into his observations and theories, which stand in pretty sharp contrast to conventional science and industrial practices.
Okay.
Our mission here is really to pull out the core of Schauberger's perspective, understand his warnings about the path we're on, and explore the, well, unconventional solutions he proposed, all strictly based on what's in these sources in front of us.
Right. Based on the sources, it sounds like a journey into understanding, as they describe it, the energetic phenomena that underlie physical manifestation. And according to these sources, grasping this is absolutely critical for the future of humanity. Okay, let's unpack this then.
So the sources, they start by painting a pretty stark picture of the state of the world's resources today. They highlight rapidly shrinking forests and vast areas of arable land, increasingly under threat from drought, desertification, fire, flood, you name it.
And the sources attribute the blame, according to Schauberger's work, squarely to our present systems of land and forest management.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Described as mechanistic, purely profit-driven, and lacking any real long-term view or concern for ability to support future generations.
Exactly. The specific consequences detailed in the sources are things like, over-clearing forests for agriculture,
Right.
which then leads to subsequent plowing, causing soil erosion, desertification, the loss of minerals, and salination. It gets pretty bad. The sources suggest this mismanagement has reached a point where feeding an expanding population seems almost impossible.
Wow. And it goes beyond just the physical damage, doesn't it? The sources, they lament the loss of traditional knowledge and practices.
That natural interaction.
Yeah, that natural interaction with habitat, calling it a malevolent philosophy that's guiding humanity towards disaster of hitherto unparalleled proportions. Strong words.
Very strong. And in striking contrast, nature's true function is described as extraordinarily selfless. Forests, for example, temper the climate. They can calm storms, provide oxygen and water.
Right.
The call from these sources is to turn away from this competitive, exploitative approach we have now and, follow nature's lead for restoration.
Okay, here's where, for me, it gets really interesting because Schauberger's fundamental ideas about how nature actually works are very different from the conventional physics described in these sources.
Baffling.
He talks about underlying energetic phenomena and something he called metamorphic currents, referencing the ancient Greek concept of pantarei. Everything flows.
That's it. He makes a core distinction between what the sources refer to as techno-academic motion
Techno-academic motion.
and natural planetary motion.
Okay, so techno-academic motion, what's that described as? Unnatural.
Yeah, unnatural. It's predominantly centrifugal, moving outward from a center, increasing pressure, generating heat.
Okay.
And the sources make some pretty dramatic claims here, linking this kind of motion to serious problems.
Like what kind of problem?
Well, the sources suggest it even causes things like X-ray-like emanations
Wow.
that they claim can provoke nuclear fission in cells, which they link to cancer. And they say it contributes to sclerotic deposits in vessels, similar to arteriosclerosis in humans.
That's a huge claim from these texts. How does this motion specifically impact something like water, then?
That's where the contrast becomes really clear. The sources say this techno-academic motion causes water to lose its natural carrying capacity and tractive force.
Okay.
It becomes what they call tired and sluggish, causing it to sink. They link this directly to the observed sinking groundwater table in places like Central Europe.
All right, the sinking water table.
Yeah. It's seen as a decomposive force,
Yeah.
basically promoting decay.
And the opposite happens with natural planetary motion. Is that the idea?
Exactly the opposite, according to the sources. This natural motion is predominantly centrifugal, moving inward towards the center.
Inward. Okay.
It's cooling, and it's suction generating. The sources say this is the motion that encourages water in all growth to reproduce, regenerate, and upwardly evolve.
So less explosion, more implosion, essentially. Is that a fair way to put it based on the sources?
Precisely. A classic example given in the sources is observing the mountain trout.
Ah, the trout example.
Yeah, holding its position in torrential flows or leaping powerfully up waterfalls. They describe this motion as water winding inward about its own fall axis through hollow spiral curves.
Like a vortex.
Kind of, yeah, a specific type. This movement, they claim, demonstrates how levitation can actually prevail over gravitation.
Levitation over gravitation.
That's what they say. This spiritedness of animated water through this specific motion can be intensified to surge upwards, like you see in powerful mountain springs.
And this natural centripetal motion generates what kinds of forces, according to the texts?
According to the sources, it generates biomagnetic upsuctional forces. This leads to what they call specific densation.
Specific densation.
Yeah, making the substance, particularly water, denser in a structured way. It also creates concentrating, formative, and levitational energy.
Okay.
And the sources make a point of saying this energy is the opposite of what we conventionally call electricity.
The opposite of electricity. Okay, so unnatural motion creates decay and downward energy, while natural motion creates life and upward energy linked to this specific spiraling inward movement.
That's the core distinction the sources make regarding motion.
Yeah, fascinating.
Now, a concept heavily emphasized alongside motion in these sources is temperature, and more specifically, the temperature gradient.
The temperature gradient, right.
They describe this not as a static condition, but as a movement of temperature itself. And this movement, this gradient, is presented as determining the energy form of water's movement, whether it supports or negates life.
And the crucial point within this, according to the sources, revolves around the plus 4 degrees C, or 39.2 degrees hour anomaly point of water.
That specific temperature.
Yes, exactly. The sources state that movement towards this specific temperature creates a positive temperature gradient.
Okay, positive gradient towards plus 4C.
Which increases water's density, its dynamics, potential, and energy. Conversely, movement away from plus 4 degrees C creates a negative gradient, leading to the opposite reduced density, energy, vitality.
So water is presented as the carrier of nutrient salts. Yeah. But how it does that depends entirely on this temperature gradient.
Exactly. Whether water dissolves, transports, or deposits nutrients is tied to the temperature changes it experiences. The natural metabolism of the Earth, as described in the sources, involves water penetrating different thermal zones in the ground, encountering what they call carbones, described as residues of earlier life or mother substances, and interacting with these based on the surrounding temperature.
So could you give an example of this natural temperature-dependent process from the sources? Okay, sure. One example they give is how rising heat from below forces groundwater nutrients upwards towards the surface.
Right.
Then, the sources say, night cooling causes this groundwater to sink again, filtering itself and depositing nutrient salts in the root zone just below the surface.
Ah, like a natural pump and filter system.
Kind of, yeah. They describe this as a constantly self-repeating process that creates the vital nutrient depot that plants rely on.
And disrupting this natural temperature-dependent circulation is fundamentally damaging then.
According to the sources, absolutely. Particularly disrupting the interaction between heat rising from below and cooling from above, like night cooling or the cooling effect of shade. They present this disruption as fundamentally damaging to growth and entire ecosystems.
This temperature dependence and the focus on natural movement, this leads directly into the source's critique of modern forestry practices, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It's a key connection. The sources argue that modern forestry goes directly against these natural laws, and they link this to the widespread phenomenon of forest death, or Waldsterben, observed particularly in Central Europe.
Right, Waldsterben. What specific practices did the sources highlight as, well, disastrous?
Things like clear felling large areas, reducing rotation periods, which means, harvesting trees before they're fully mature.
Immature timber, yeah.
Planting monocultures instead of diverse forests, and crucially, exposing shade-demanding species like pine, fir, and beech directly to sunlight.
Why is exposing these specific trees to direct sunlight considered so bad, according to these sources?
Well, the sources claim it causes an internal rise in temperature within the tree itself.
Okay.
They liken this to arteriosclerosis in humans, saying it dilates the ascending water in the rising ducts, preventing the wood from properly lignifying, from hardening correctly.
Ah, so the wood structure is compromised.
Exactly. The result, they say, is porous, weak wood that is highly susceptible to disease.
And the impact on the ground and water level.
Well, the sources explain that removing the forest cover reduces the vital potential differences in the ground. It inhibits the buildup of the necessary counter-temperatures that drive that natural water circulation we just discussed.
Okay, so it breaks that cycle.
Right. This causes groundwater to sink and the nutrient depot to withdraw from the root zone. The trees essentially become undernourished, the vegetation declines, and the sources warn this can sometimes irreversibly lead to things like karst development, basically, the bedrock becoming exposed and barren.
And the sources mention specific symptoms of this decline in the trees themselves.
Yes, they list things like red rot, ring shake, rotten cores, and even cancer-like formations in the trees.
Cancer in trees.
Yeah, they make a powerful point. Old-growth forests were water producers, nurturing the water cycle. Today's young, mismanaged stands, they claim, are water consumers because their roots are damaged and cannot interact properly with the deep, cool groundwater.
It sounds like a fundamental misunderstanding of the forest's role, according to these sources, just seeing it as timber.
That's the argument presented. The conventional forester sought rapid turnover and quantitative growth, but by exploiting light and heat in ignorance, the sources say, of these natural laws, they achieve the opposite, a qualitative decline.
Right.
The timber became diseased and weak, a burden rather than a benefit. The sources state, quite starkly, the economic death of people is always preceded by the death of its forests.
That's a profound and rather terrifying claim from the sources. Now, the critique extends from forests to the soil itself and agriculture, right? It's not just about trees.
It does, yeah, it's holistic.
Yeah.
The sources state bluntly that the blood of the earth constantly deteriorates, the fertility of the soil decreases.
And they are particularly critical of artificial fertilizers.
Heavily critical. They compare them to cocaine injections. Quite provocative language.
Wow.
Saying they provide a brief burst of blossoming followed by collapse, requiring increasingly stronger doses.
Unsustainable.
Exactly. The sources claim these fertilizers discharge the soil and water of their natural potential energy. They suggest they act like anodes, drawing outlying nutrients centripetally inward towards the application point, but discharging the topsoil over wide areas.
Discharging the topsoil.
Yeah, draining its energy. They even claim this causes the soil's geopsyche to vanish.
Geopsyche. What do the sources mean by that? That's another unique term.
It is. It's one of Schauberger's unique terms, described in the sources as sort of the vital energy or spirit of the soil.
The life force of the soil.
Essentially, yes. They suggest that practices like using artificial fertilizers drain this essential vitality.
Okay, so artificial inputs are bad for the soil's energy and life force. What about conventional tools? The sources also critique the use of iron or steel agricultural implements. That seems surprising.
Yes, that's seen as detrimental too. The sources argue that the friction from these iron or steel tools generates heat and weak electric currents in the soil. This, they claim, deposits fine iron particles, basically rust, which actively dry out the soil.
Rust drying the soil. Never heard that before. So the sources see these common practices, fertilizers and iron tools, as actively working against nature.
Exactly. These practices, according to the sources, halt the natural influx of raw materials needed for healthy growth and transform them into negatively acting, decomposed substances.
Okay.
The ultimate result, they claim, is the degradation of the native soil and its inability to provide sustenance.
So if that's the problem presented in these sources, this sort of downward spiral, what are the alternatives Schauberger proposed? What's the solution side of this?
Well, the core idea, repeated again and again in the sources, is what they call ecotechnology.
Ecotechnology.
Essentially, understanding and then copying nature's methods, particularly that natural planetary motion we talked about earlier.
Okay, copying nature. How would that apply to something like water then? How do you copy that motion?
For water, the solution presented is to move it using what they describe as cycloid-spiral space curve motion.
Right, that specific winding motion.
Yeah, this in-winding, screw-form, radial axial movement that happens within and about itself, crucially excluding light, heat, and air during the process.
Excluding light, heat, and air. Interesting.
Devices like cycloid spiral whirl pipes or something called the centripulsar are mentioned as examples of how to achieve this artificially.
And achieving this specific motion does what to the water, according to the sources? What's the benefit?
According to the sources, this process leads to that specific densation we mentioned.
Making it denser, right?
Significant cooling, and the generation of biomagnetism and levitational energy. This is presented as the basis for producing what the sources call biomagnetically supercharged water, or healing water.
Healing water.
Yeah, essentially just ordinary water transformed by being moved planetarily in that specific way in a sealed egg-shaped vessel. The shape is important too, apparently.
So the shape and the movement are key to restoring water's vitality and energetic properties, according to the sources. What about forestry? What's the naturalist management solution they propose?
In forestry, it's about intelligent selective felling that minimizes light exposure to the forest floor.
Minimizing light.
Yeah. It emphasizes natural regeneration and protecting young, shade-loving trees from direct sun. The sources suggest that farmers, who they feel often have an instinctive understanding of natural processes, could actually be better forest custodians if they truly understood that trees breathe through their bark and need protection from direct light and heat.
Interesting idea about farmers as custodians. And for agriculture, given the critique of iron tools and artificial fertilizer, what's the alternative there?
A key recommendation from the sources is replacing iron or steel implements with those made of copper or copper alloys.
Copper tools.
Yes. These are described as cooling and refreshing the soil, not discharging it energetically like iron is claimed to do.
Okay.
The sources claim trials showed significant increases in yield and grain quality estimates. Up to 30–50% increase are mentioned.
30 to 50%. That's huge.
It's a big claim. Using rust-free copper or bronze shovels for handling compost is also specifically recommended.
Right, copper for compost too. And what about the compost itself? Did the sources have specific methods?
Yes, they distinguish between conventional warm oxidation compost, which they say, maintains productivity,
Okay.
and what Schauberger advocates, compost made through cold fermentation processes, again, excluding light, heat, and air.
Cold fermentation.
This method, they claim, produces high-grade ethericities and results in super-quality growth.
Aethericities. That's another of those unique terms again. Subtle energies.
Yes, it seems to relate to subtle life energies or vital forces in Schauberger's system, according to the sources. The cold fermentation process is apparently key to generating them for the soil.
The sources also include some almost mystical-sounding examples of Schauberger's methods.
They do, yeah. There are mentions of using water barrels, stirring them with a wooden oar, adding crumbled clay, and even singing.
Singing?
Which they call tonzingen, to create copper water for watering skick fields.
Singing to make special water.
And there's also a historical example referenced about restoring deserts using underground waveform canals alloyed with copper and zinc filled with rainwater. These examples certainly push the boundaries of conventional understanding presented in the sources.
Definitely unconventional. So underneath all these processes and solutions, what are the core mechanics described in the sources? Concepts like qualogen came up.
Right, qualogen. The sources describe it as something the Earth procreates through its own movement.
Or procreate.
Yeah. It's said to be what endows growth with the ability to reproduce and evolve. The sources call it a negatively potentiated concentrate of dynogens, described as essential for high-quality growth. It's an abstract term, but seems to represent a fundamental energetic quality derived from natural Earth processes.
A fundamental quality.
Right.
Okay. And implosion is also central, right? You mentioned it earlier.
Absolutely. Implosion is presented as the direct opposite of explosion. It's tied specifically to cold, oxidizing processes.
Okay, cold processes.
And the sources claim these processes generate the counterforce to physical weight, what they call the levitational force.
Ah, so implosion generates levitation, while explosion generates gravity or downward force. Is that the connection?
That's the connection the sources make, yes. This implosive force, they claim, leads to increases in both the quantity and quality of growth. And fascinatingly, they suggest it's the principle behind achieving mechanical power that is virtually free.
Virtually free energy through implosion. That's a bold claim from the sources.
It is indeed. Another fundamental concept mentioned is pulsation.
Pulsation.
The sources describe this as the inherent life activity in all organic bodies and the Earth itself, caused by that cycloid space curve motion we discussed.
That spiraling motion again?
Yeah. They say pulsation brings fructogen and seminal substances into contact for binding and transformation. Disturbance of this animating rhythm is presented as the root cause of disease.
So a lack of natural pulsing movement leads to illness, whether in soil, water, or even living things.
That's the strong implication in the sources, yes.
Yeah.
They also describe water not just as, H2O, but as a complex carrier and accumulator of radiation.
Radiation from where?
From the sun, described as a cathode, attracting oxygen, and from the moon, described as an anode, attracting matter.
Sun as cathode, moon as anode.
Yeah. They state this radiation profoundly influences water's energetic state and motion. It's a very different way of looking at water's interaction with celestial bodies than you typically find.
It really is. So ultimately, growth itself is presented almost metaphysically. What about transmission of will.
Right. Growth is presented as a direct result of what the sources call transmission of will.
Right.
This, they claim, happens through the rhythmical reversal of polarity in the mediator of life, which is water.
Polarity reversal in water.
And they make a striking assertion based on this, that this process allows any soil to be made fertile, because the soil itself is merely a resistance, a medium for the movement of this nascent will.
So fertility isn't just about soil composition in the chemical sense, but about the soil's ability to facilitate the transmission of this fundamental will via water, driven by these energetic principles.
That appears to be Schauberger's perspective,
Yeah.
as presented to these specific sources. Yes.
Yeah.
A very different framework.
Okay, that's a lot of complex, definitely unconventional ideas. Why should any of this matter to you, our listener, today? What's the takeaway?
Well, because according to these sources, the consequences of ignoring nature's fundamental laws aren't just abstract scientific points. They aren't just theories.
Right.
They manifest in the real world as climatic instability, the dying forests we see, unproductive land, water shortages.
Things we're actually seeing now.
Exactly. And yes, the sources even link them to human diseases like cancer and arteriosclerosis, all tied back, they claim, to unnatural motion and negative temperature influences.
The sources paint a pretty urgent picture then, arguing that our current path is leading us towards a catastrophic lack of water and the destruction of our ability to produce food, potentially ending in economic, cultural collapse, and even conflict. It's quite apocalyptic sounding in parts.
That's certainly the warning conveyed. However, the sources also offer a powerful message of hope. They don't just point out problems.
Okay.
They claim that solutions absolutely exist available to us now by understanding and copying nature's fundamental energetic processes. Machines and devices based on these principles, this eco-technology, are suggested as the means to combat this madness, as they put it.
So it demands a radical shift in perspective, doesn't it? Away from destructive, heat-generating centrifugal technologies. The outward-moving stuff towards life-affirming, cooling, centripetal ones, the inward-moving natural processes.
That's the core shift proposed.
And the sources claim that embracing this knowledge could lead not to scarcity, but to a superfluity, an abundance of food, raw materials, fuel, and power.
It's a vision of abundance rooted in cooperation with nature's inherent forces, as presented in this material.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive into Viktor Schauberger's work, based strictly on the sources we examined today, presents a truly challenging view of the world, one where our most common practices are seen as fundamentally antagonistic to life itself.
It starkly contrasts a mechanistic, exploitative approach with an energetic, nurturing one rooted in observing and copying nature's subtle processes of motion and temperature.
It certainly gives you something to think about. I mean, if, as these sources suggest, fundamental concepts like gravity aren't always constant, if water's movement is far more than just mechanics, but a transformation of energy linked to life itself, and if the very quality of life around us is determined by something as subtle as the temperature gradient and the type of motion of Earth's vital fluids, what else have we fundamentally misunderstood about the world around us?
A powerful question to sit with, definitely. This has been a deep dive into a truly unique perspective on our relationship with the natural world.